皆様、まもなくリージョナルセッション
We will start the regional session 1 US soon, so please be seated.
それではリージョナルセッション1米国
We would like to start the regional session 1 US. The moderator will be Dr. Kubo. Panelist, Dr. Green, Mr. Lohman, and Dr. Mori. Now, Dr. Kubo. Thank you very much for introduction. My name is Fumiaki Kubo. Well, thank you very much for coming to this session when there are many other sessions as well, and in spite of your busy schedule. This is a session on U.S. presidential election. We're not poll specialists, so we cannot actually say which candidate is obtaining what sort of a percentage of support in which state. But we would like to discuss this presidential election in relation to diplomacy. Looking at the presidential election, we can think of diplomacy and in various aspects. In 2016, when there was a presidential election, Mr. Trump was actually elected, and it had a major impact on U.S. foreign policies. Mr. Trump does not have any political history nor experience in military, but there were two major parties of Democrat and Republican, and this was the first time that the person without any military or diplomatic relation actually was selected after 1945. Republicans nominated Wilkie in 1940. But after 1945, Trump was the first case. And in 2016, when there was an election campaign, his manifesto is American First and isolationism. And that showed a tendency of isolationist, and he was against the TPP. So he also showed the protectionist trait. This was, I think, unclassic and rare in the Republicans' ideas. But it obtained the nomination by the Republican Party, and from now on, a person who will actually propose a similar policy might be elected as a nominate for the Republican Party, and we have some concerns about this, seeing it from outside. But 3 years have passed since then. And looking at the 3 years, the past 3 years, well, some concerns of us were actually verified, and the others were not. And then, after the 3 years, soon there will be next presidential election. I would like to ask several questions to the panelists. And I would like each panelist to speak for 3 or 4 minutes, and we will have many rounds of that, and then we will open the floor for questions. The first question I have from the Republicans. Of course, Mr. Trump is trying to be re-elected. And regarding his diplomacy, regarding Russia, Ukraine, and Syria, I think among the Republicans, there's no strong opposition. There are some strong opposition and criticism against his views. But in the Republicans, they will not challenge Mr. Trump in preliminary election, for example, to stop Mr. Trump to be re-elected. There's a possibility that some weak candidates might field their candidacy, but there is no major actually challenge to Mr. Trump's re-election. So how do you view the current situation of the Republicans? Now, Dr. Green first.
I have to warn you that I've worked on a lot of presidential campaigns in the U.S. I worked for John McCain's campaign, and he lost. I worked for Mitt Romney's campaign, and he lost. Then I was a senior advisor for Jeb Bush's campaign, and he lost. So I moved over to Marco Rubio's campaign, and he lost. And then Governor Kasich asked me to join his campaign, and I said, no, if I join your campaign, you'll lose. I did work for President Bush. I worked for President Bush for 5 years in the White House, but I did not work on his campaign. So my ability to predict may not be so good. Also, I should say I'm an independent, although I mostly have worked for Republicans, and I'm a center-right thinker on foreign policy. With those caveats, the Republican Party's in a very strange place. There's no doubt about it. Depending on the poll, close to 90% of Republicans support President Trump. Now, Republicans are only less than 1/3 of voters now, but within the Republican Party, and therefore within Republican primaries, it's very dangerous for any politician to oppose President Trump. There was a survey a few days ago that showed that over half of Republicans think that Trump is a better president than Abraham Lincoln. It's insane. It's very hard to explain this. And so you will not see Republicans in the Congress opposing Trump on the issues that matter most to his base. And those are issues about the wall and immigration or some social or cultural or identity issues. Very few, basically no Republicans in the House or Senate are going to challenge the president on those issues. However, on foreign policy and defense, there is a quite strong wall or phalanx of Republicans who are blocking President Trump. And for President Trump's base, the issues that they take a stand on are less important. So it's things like alliances. Because public opinion polls show the highest level of support for alliances in U.S. history. Ironically, in the age of Trump, the public, especially younger voters, think that alliances are indispensable. Or public opinion polls about defending Japan or defending Korea. Somewhere between 55 and 65% of the public says we should fight to defend Japan and Korea. It's very high. If you think about it, the public is being asked to fight potentially a nuclear war to defend Japan and Korea, and they say yes. So on those issues, Republicans in the House and Senate, especially on the foreign affairs and defense committees, are taking steps to frankly block or shape or channel President Trump, not to challenge him publicly so much, but they are a counterweight. And I don't know if I'll get them in trouble, but it's pretty well known the kinds of people we're talking about. Lindsey Graham from South Carolina, Dan Sullivan from Alaska, Ben Sass from Nebraska, and so forth. They are very much, I think, aligned with the center-right think tanks from Heritage to CSIS. And they are very much aligned with President Trump's own national security team in the NSC State and Defense, who very quietly count on some of these same Republican congressmen and congresswomen and senators to block President Trump. So it's a very strange game in Washington right now. And it's because we don't have a parliamentary system. We have checks and balances that it's possible. But I guess what I would say is the Republican Party is in a strange, weird place that over half of the members think Lincoln is not as good as Trump. It's just unbelievable. But at the same time, in terms of policy matters that affect Japan, especially defense and foreign affairs, it's the same Republican Party, I think, of John McCain and Ronald Reagan and George W. Bush.
ありがとうございます。じゃあ、ローマンさんいかがでしょうか。同じ質問。
The same question to Mr. Lohman.
I think Mike basically said everything to be said on it. I think that's true, that the Republican Party's in a difficult place. I think the only question I have is going forward, how it may be developing. At this point in time, you do have stalwarts that have been around for a long time on the Hill, in particular, who are pushing back against some of Trump's ideas, especially behind closed doors, both among themselves on the Hill and directly with the president, trying to challenge some of his thinking on alliances, in particular, Japan and Korea, in a very big way. But what I worry about is going forward with the Republican Party as members leave, as they retire, as they go on and do other things. The people who are getting elected on the basis of their fealty to Donald Trump and his ideas, and an interpretation of those ideas and the way that their constituents see those ideas. And so I think over time you could have the Republican Party develop in a much different way that cares less about some of these things. And I focus a little bit on the what they interpret to be his ideas, because I think in so many places, if you really look at what has happened in the last 3 years, it hasn't been what some people feared. You mentioned in the opening that there's been some good things and some bad things, and I think in those first few months of the Trump administration, a lot of the worries that we had at that time haven't come to pass, and haven't come to pass because a lot of people are working hard on them. And actually, I do think that Trump is able to evolve, and some of his ideas have changed over time. But when you look at what's actually happened on the ground in Asia in particular, I think there's more continuity with the previous administration and the administration before that than there is major differences.
ありがとうございます。それでは同じ質問ですが、森さんいかがでしょうか。
Thank you very much. The same question to Professor Mori. Thank you very much. I think I quite agree with the ideas of Dr. Green and Lohman. Last month, the poll told us that 90% of the supporters of the Republicans support the president. And of course, there would be fear among the Republicans that they may really be criticized if they run in the election against this President Trump. And among the voters of the United States, to really support the current Trump administration is highly evaluated and supported. And I think this solidifies the foundation of Trump. But there is a gap, indeed, between the president and the Republican Party. Dr. Green talked about the alliance. And looking at the result of the poll, I think I'm looking at the same numbers. But the American voters are strongly supporting the alliance. However, well, I think within the Republican Party, there are similar mindsets. But when it comes to Trump's individual concept of alliance or his rhetoric, how he describes the alliance would give rise to apprehension and concern. Some think that the United States would lose interest in their allies and they would become more introverted. And every time I hear such concerns, I show the poll that a lot of Americans support the allies. But I think there is a certain gap between those polls and the public that supports alliance and how Trump sees alliance. Thank you. Now, another question about the Republican Party, the commercial policy or trade policy. So the presidential candidate recently of Republican Romney, King, George W. Bush, had supported and advocated for NAFTA and open trade policy and to participate in TPP. So liberal trade was supported by the conventional Republican presidential candidates. So far, it was just a minority within the Republican that the protectionism was supported. So TPA, Trade Promotion Act, 85% of the Democrats voted against that TPA, but I think within the Republicans, about 85% of the members of the Diet coming from the Republican Party had voted for TPA. But now it seems the position is reversed. TPP, well, U.S. withdrawal from TPP, and the position of Trump being a protectionist in Pennsylvania, Ohio, Wisconsin, and Michigan. In these states, the laborers, the blue collars greatly supported Trump with his protectionist pledge. And this Trump's protectionist ideal are now attracting, especially in the House, attracting the interest of the members of the House. So what's your take on this isolationist attitude? Maybe it was a minority in the Republican in the recent past, but now is it a majority within the Republican to become the protectionist in the world? Or do we not need to worry about this? Well, the Democrats already have quite a few members of the party who are against protectionism, or rather the free trade. So they are swaying towards protectionism, even the Democrats. And this is not necessarily a good news for the world. So, Mr. Lohman, first of all.
First of all, briefly, something may be lost in the translation, but I don't think that this administration is isolationist. I wouldn't say that. That may have been something that was feared in the first months.
Protectionist.
Right. But yeah, it does tend to protectionism. I think on trade there's an odd situation in that the polling very consistently points to broad support for free trade in the United States, bipartisan support. And the politicians, on the other hand, are getting more protectionist. And I think you can attribute that to a couple things. One is that the depth of support for free trade is very small in the United States, very, very shallow. We've done some polling at Heritage, and it's remarkable how little people think about trade at all. If you really ask them, what are your primary concerns, trade is way, way down the list. Whether they like it or hate it, it's way down the list. If you ask them about NAFTA, for instance, the answer you get more than anything else is, what's NAFTA? I mean, believe it or not, we talk about these things all the time and how it's affecting everybody and all that, but people are not thinking about this very much. On the other hand, you have these concentrations of basically special interests, labor unions, in the states that sort of matter the most in the next election, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin. And these groups are very active, and the candidates are courting their support. So they don't care about this kind of shallow support for trade. It doesn't mean anything to their possible election, but if they can get the support of very powerful, intensely interested groups in those states, it can drive their success in the primary and then in the election. And I think, unfortunately, for the future of trade in the United States, trade policy, that's going to be the contest, is all of these candidates chasing after those groups and trying to outdo each other on the protectionist side. You're not going to have anyone really standing for free trade. I mean, the most free trade oriented among them is Biden, because Senator Biden has a long, Senator Biden, because he was in the Senate voting on these things, he has a long record of, he voted for some trade agreements, voted against some others, but he supported NAFTA, and he supported China's WTO accession. And he's trying to distance himself a little bit from that because he knows that that's a liability in this election. So I think the future of trade policy in the U.S. is pretty dim, honestly. I think we're probably out of the business of big trade agreements, real free trade agreements, for the foreseeable future. And that is a reflection, really, of how Republicans have changed over time. Because Democrats have always been against trade, at least in the modern sort of free trade era. You look at all the agreements that passed in the 2000s that Bush promoted. A couple of them passed with 24 Democrat votes out of both houses. I mean, they've always been against trade. They've always had these instincts, and now President Trump has the same instincts, and he's pulling Republicans along with him because these are issues where you don't want to take the president on head on. It's easier for you to go along, and even some of the stalwarts are hesitate. People in positions of power like Senator Grassley and others who have been free traders in the past, they don't want to take the president on.
2020年に誰が勝っても、特にバイ
2020, whoever will be a winner, even if it's Biden, in the next 4 years, is there any possibility that the U.S. will not come back to TPP? Is it zero possibility that U.S. will come back to TPP?
森さん、同じ。
The same question to Dr. Mori. Thank you. Mr. Trump's trade policy, I have to say two things. One is tariffs, using tariffs as means, and this will actually seal American economy from international economic system. And this is the end result is not just protecting American industry. For example, Mr. Trump asking China to import more and asking China to open financial market. So he is aiming to expand economic relations with China and using imposing tariffs as a means to do that. That's what I have always thought. So just protecting certain sectors of industry, it might work out, but at the end of the day, it will seal American economy from the overall global economy. It's not that the case. In other words, asymmetrical trade was done, and he is aiming at new economic equilibrium or balance, and that is why he is using protectionist measures and tariffs. His aim is not actually going to the protectionism and rejecting trade. It's not the case. That's the impression I have. I think we have to pay attention to that aspect as well.
I think you also have to put in perspective the impact that trade has on the U.S. economy. I care a lot about trade, and I've debated a lot about it, written a lot about it. So it pains me to say it's actually not the most important thing in the U.S. economy. I mean, it represents a small part of it, and then what Trump has done, a smaller part. And he's almost at the worst case scenario. So if you look at the performance of the U.S. economy, it's been good in the last 2 years, largely as a result of the tax cuts in the United States. And those tax cuts have had a much bigger impact on the U.S. economy than Trump's trade war. I think even the pro-trade people talk about the impact being something around 0.5 percentage point on GDP, which is a lot. Okay, it's a lot of money, it's a lot of jobs, but it's not devastating. It doesn't have the effect of isolating the United States from the global economy. It's creating a lot of dislocation. It's creating a lot of losses in the United States. It's fraying relationships and doing some other things, but it's not tubing the United States economy or keeping us sort of isolated from the rest of the global economy.
ありがとうございます。ではどうぞお待たせしました。
I agree with Walter's assessment, but I'm not as pessimistic on the whole. We're in a strange place in the United States, and this may last for another administration or two, where when it comes to trade policy, Republicans and Democrats have switched so that the Republican brain sits on top of a Democratic body and the Democratic brain sits on top of a Republican body. So in public opinion polls, Democrats now, not politicians, but average citizens, Democrats are more pro-trade and because they're more globalist and they're younger. And Republicans are increasingly older and white and are more skeptical of change, more skeptical of globalization, more fearful of free trade. But the Democratic politicians depend on the labor unions, who are more protectionist, while Republicans running for Congress tend to depend much more on farmers and Chamber of Commerce, which are more pro-trade. So the brains and the bodies have switched. It's like a weird Frankenstein movie from the 1950s. And usually those end well, after a few people are killed. And eventually the peasants get together and take over Frankenstein. And so I think eventually this will sort itself out. And there are some promising signs. So for example, President Trump's tariff policy was blocked by two constituents that he cares about for his reelection, farmers and Wall Street. He basically, in my view, kind of agreed to a very limited ceasefire, a so-called, first phase deal with China, but it's nothing really. It's basically because he was shooting himself politically, because he depends on farmers, especially Republican members of Congress, and he needs people to have a good 401k, a good retirement account from Wall Street. So he's limited in how much protectionism and tariffs he can push. And meanwhile, the Democratic side has changed quite a bit. 10, 12 years ago, there were fewer than 24 so-called blue dog Democrats, conservative Democrats in the House. And Nancy Pelosi punished them, including some of my classmates from college who were pro-trade, Midwestern Republicans, and they were basically banished and forced out by Nancy Pelosi. Today, there are over 100, probably about 120 blue dog Democrats who are pro-trade, because the Democrats have done really well in the age of Trump in suburbs and exurbs, and a lot of those people are like the old blue dogs. They're pro-trade, they're pro-alliance, they're progressive on domestic issues, but they're somewhat more traditional or conservative, almost Republican on national security and trade. So the Congress is kind of reshaping as we talk. I don't know where that will go, but it's definitely changing in a way where there are more voices for trade in the House than there were, especially on the Democratic side a few years ago. The other thing is, will we go back to TPP? I wouldn't say 0%, but less than 50, that's for sure. But, the future of international trade agreements may not be about tariffs or even state-owned enterprise disciplines. The future of international rulemaking and trade agreements may look a lot like the digital agreement that the U.S. and Japan which is the only really significant part of this U.S.-Japan agreement. Digital rules, 5G, data reciprocity, that may end up in 5, 10, 15 years being what historians consider the real international rulemaking and economic institution building. And on those issues, I don't think American minds are made up. I think a president who wants to do something big on those issues can build a constituency within the U.S. And the Democrats, by the way, the Democratic candidates, some of them are pro-trade. Buttigieg, Klobuchar, not all of them, but leadership matters too. So I think it sort of depends on who's in charge in 2021 and how they frame this, and whether it's about digital issues or it's about tariffs or things that are a little more 20th century.
ありがとうございます。それでは、今度は少しばかり
Well, Democrats candidate. There's a discussion among the candidates themselves, and I would like to touch upon that. There are many candidates, and we cannot actually analyze each one of them. It takes 3-5 years. So Mr. Biden, Buttigieg, Warren, and Sanders, and Bloomberg, maybe. We would like to have them in mind to discuss Democratic candidates. So among those, there's discussion and debate on diplomacy, about direction, orientation. Are there anything you have noticed, or are there any points of concern, especially from Japan's point of view? Where should we be careful? And who is the worst candidate for Japan? Dr. Mori first.
ありがとうございます。
Thank you very much. There were 4 candidates that Dr. Kubo mentioned, and listening to their statements, climate change, it is they are all for taking measures, and also non-proliferation. But nuclear agreement, they are also for that. But Ms. Warren, about the maybe she thinks the U.S. forces overseas should be cut. And Mr. Sanders say similar things. Of course, if they become president, they might change what they were speaking during the campaign, so we don't have to worry about that. But as far as we hear and see, that is one point that we have to be careful about. And I forgot to mention about TPP, but I think a renegotiation might be a possibility. Well, Japan, we would like U.S. to come back to TPP, but there is a strong possibility that it will not come back.
So Elizabeth Warren has put out the clearest foreign policy and trade papers, and they're very worrisome if you care about trade and security. I mean, her trade policy paper has been widely criticized, Washington Post to the Wall Street Journal, for being more protectionist than Trump, because she puts in so many conditions for any trade agreement that the U.S. could not sign a trade agreement with itself and get it through the Congress. And on security, she does clearly say that she would cut defense spending. The other candidates are a little more vague in what they've stated. I think that you can kind of guess by where the Democratic foreign policy advisors are going. And it's hard to know that in Tokyo because they're all keeping it very quiet because they don't know who's going to win. So not like me, it's like, I'm with Jeb Bush, woohoo. The Democrats are a lot smarter. So they're being very quiet. But one of the games we play in Washington is who's going with who. So I'm not going to say names. But there's not a huge difference in the foreign policy views of the people going to Biden, Buttigieg, Kamala Harris, or Klobuchar. The real difference is their rank. The most senior people have quietly gone to Biden. The second most senior people have quietly gone to Warren. Buttigieg has attracted the kind of young, sort of best and brightest from Brookings and CSIS and Carnegie. Not so much Heritage, of course, which is more Republican. But they're a bit junior. The difference is how much risk are they willing to take? If you're more junior, you take a risk. And if you get lucky and your guy wins, the person who was your boss in the last Democratic administration works for you in the next Democratic administration. But I have to say, I don't see a huge, at least among the Asia experts I've been watching, I don't see a huge difference among them, which is somewhat reassuring because, a Warren administration, which I would not support, she's too far to the left for me, there would nevertheless be some mainstream internationalist Democrats in the Pentagon and the State Department to correct course, I think. I think for independents, the most attractive candidate on foreign policy is going to be a centrist, a Klobuchar or a Buttigieg, maybe Biden. But we can talk more about the appeal of these candidates. The one reassuring thing is not a huge difference among the advisors on Asia policy or foreign policy. Trade is different. Trade, there are huge differences among the advisors.
Lohman,
Mr. Lohman?
Yeah, I mean, I don't. Well, first of all, I started thinking when Mori-san said that he didn't think that the candidates would actually do what they said. I felt like I saw that movie before too, right? That's the movie we all saw in 2016 and didn't end the way we thought. And Trump actually did all the things he said he was going to do. And so it might be some pressure on the candidates this time around to do the same once they win the election, sort of pressure that they haven't had before. But setting that aside, I think it's more a difference in degree among all of them. Elizabeth Warren and Sanders in particular are opposed to U.S. foreign involvement abroad, especially wars. I think Elizabeth Warren came out at one point a couple months ago and said something about pulling troops out of the Middle East, and then later corrected to make sure people understood she's talking about getting out of wars. So it'd be a difference in degree, I think. And similar on trade policy. I mean, what has upended things on trade is that Trump has a trade policy that Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders can support. So I think the problem with the differences in degree is that it's still trending away from at least current commitments in the world, and it's trending away on a free and open trade policy. But I don't think it'll be anything sudden. It'll be a continuation of what we have seen in the last 3 years.
ありがとうございます。それではですね、次にもうすでに少し話題として出ましたけれども。
Okay, thank you. It was briefly mentioned already. The Trump's administration's policy on China, Japan, under the Obama administration, thought that Obama should take a hardline policy a bit more against China. But that's not what President Obama did. However, under Trump, Trump had adopted a totally different set of policies. So how do you evaluate Trump's policy against China? And in the 2020 election, this policy of Trump against China may be conducive to the slowdown of U.S. economy, but what is your outlook of this policy against China? If the Democratic president becomes a reality, then how would this China policy change? Warren and Sanders, in terms of trade, may be more harsh and bitter. But in the military aspect, they may have a different set of policies. So it really depends on who would win the candidate race in the Democrats. But how do you think the Chinese policy or the China policy would change? Maybe within 3 or 4 minutes, please. Dr. Green.
Let me start to answer that by going back to your previous question about the Democratic candidates and just pointing out one thing, which is most presidents since the end of the Cold War, in fact, almost all presidents since the end of the Cold War, promised to do less in the world. All of them, including George W. Bush, they all promised to do less. That's very appealing in elections. Actually, in the Cold War even, John F. Kennedy and Ronald Reagan were the only presidents who promised to do more in terms of military commitments, trade agreements. So the norm in American political history is for the president to campaign on doing less and saying, I'm going to give you more money in your wallet. I'm not going to give money to the Japanese or the Chinese. It's very simple politics. But what happens is, within a year or so, some crisis. For Bush, it was 9/11. For Clinton, it was the North Korea crisis and China. For Obama, it was China eventually. And they tend to go back to international commitments. So I would just say don't be too distracted by what the candidates say because that's not necessarily what they'll do. On China, I think President Trump's administration deserves credit because the 2017 National Security Strategy from the White House, I worked on 2 of these for President Bush when I was in the White House on the NSC staff. But the Trump NSS, the National Security Strategy in 2017, was the first one to clearly say that China is a strategic rival. We were in strategic competition. All the previous ones, from George Herbert Walker Bush to Clinton to Bush to Obama, all of them framed U.S.-China relations in the context of cooperation on some global challenge. Obama was going to cooperate on climate change. Bush was going to cooperate on terrorism. Clinton was going to cooperate on everything since the Cold War was over, even George Herbert Walker Bush. So I think the Trump administration gets credit for saying clearly China's a strategic competitor. And when they said that, nobody really disagreed. Even Hank Paulson, who's considered one of the most pro-China figures in American politics, said, yes, we are in an era of strategic competition. So I think they will get credit for changing the debate. But what they have not figured out is how to win a strategic competition. They've done, in my view, better than Obama on the military side. As Walter pointed out yesterday on our panel, many more freedom of navigation operations, increasing the defense budget. Definitely better than the Obama administration on defense. But fundamentally, when they say China is a revisionist power, what is China trying to revise? It's trying to revise the system of rules and international law. So obviously, and U.S. alliances. So obviously, the way to win in this competition is to reinforce alliances, reinforce international law, reinforce international agreements, but they're not doing that. They're running away from most of those, and mixed picture of alliances. So the next administration, including whether Trump gets reelected, even if Trump gets reelected, the next administration will have to calibrate the approach to compete. And I think Japan will have a very, very important voice in that, more important than any other country, no matter who wins the election. Japan will be the most important voice in Washington of foreign governments in terms of how to compete with China. And that will add some continuity, I hope. You know, each candidate on the Democratic side has a somewhat different view of China. I don't know if we can save that for later, but they're going in positions a bit different. In a way, it doesn't matter because whatever candidates say and think about China, when they come into office and confront the real China, not the one they're giving speeches about, they all adjust.
I think the
Hi.
China policy now and would be going forward in a Trump administration is President Trump himself. I mean, because he's brought in a team. We know all the people that he's brought in and respect them, and they're very good on alliances, and they're China hawks, really, and that's part of what has happened in this administration is they have taken control of the policy, and Trump has given them the room that they need in order to do this. He's given a lot more room than the Obama administration to the U.S. Navy, for example, in PACOM and its ability to do these FON operations. For instance, it became a complaint in the Obama administration that these were all going through a political process back in Washington, and the Obama administration was too much in the weeds on what the Navy could do and what it couldn't do, tied to climate change negotiations and all sorts of things. And that's not going on now. These people like Randy Shriver and others have the permission to go out and do what they need to do. Trump is the wild card because all of this with China has nothing to do with China, I think, for Trump. It's all a matter of trade policy. Trump doesn't like international trade so much, and he has similar complaints about Japan that he has with China. He's said many times, the EU is worse than China, or Germany is even worse than China. So he's not thinking about China in some grand geopolitical sense. I think, that's a key variable in all this. It's like Mike Pillsbury said yesterday, the threat from a G2. It seems almost absurd when you think about where we are in U.S.-China relations. But when you look at it from where Donald Trump looks at this stuff, it's not so inconceivable. Because if he gets a trade deal, things change like that. And he may become more friendly on all these other issues. When Xi Jinping calls him and says, hey, call off these operations, pinging our radars off our coast, that's interference in China, and it's not right. And just like Trump did with Kim Jong-un, he says, these military exercises are war games, and I don't like them much. Could do the same thing on something like that. So I think that's the thing to look out for. I think in a Democrat administration, I agree that we're already on this trajectory to a tighter and tighter relationship with the Chinese, and in terms of being tougher and having less room for negotiation, for movement. And I think a Democrat administration will also be pretty hawkish on China. If you read some of the statements and speeches that the candidates make, they do carve out some areas for cooperation. I think you may have a little tacking back on that, where they are looking for areas like environment and some other things where they can work with the Chinese. But there's going to be a lot of pressure coming from Congress, and maybe we can talk a little bit about Congress too later, but coming from Congress to keep the pressure on.
Mori さんいかがでしょうか。
ありがとうございます。アメリカのトランプ政
Well, Mr. Trump's China policy, I think we can sort them out in two levels. First, Mr. Trump, and then bureaucracy as a separate level. And Mr. Trump's is a economic, trade, monetary policy, and industrial policy of China. That is negotiated using Mr. Lighthizer and so on. Mushin as well. And additional tariffs, which is unpopular among the world. causing a lot of concerns. But Japan will bear some cost to change Chinese policies. Well, we can evaluate means whether it's good or not, or we can say whether it's good or not. But I think at least Mr. Trump is trying to change Chinese policy. Another is strategic competition and rivalry, and the bureaucracy is the one who focus on that. And there are two competitions between U.S. and China. One is technology area, the advanced area of technology, communication, industry, and military, and how to utilize those state-of-the-art technology. There's a competition between the two companies. And the U.S., to a significant level, even before Mr. Trump's inauguration, try to actually see the next generation of technology to be able to win in the competition. And another is the geopolitical competition to strengthen influence on third countries, like an Indo-Pacific strategy. As Mr. Lohman said, the navigation, freedom of navigation on a regular basis, exercises on regular basis. And I think Mr. Trump's administration can increase regional engagement, especially State Department is focusing on investment infrastructure and the presence of the Navy, and also investment in ports and digital Silk Road is China's initiative, and how to compete against it. So digital connectivity and cybersecurity partnership. I think that initiative has been launched, though it is not very significant yet. I think U.S. can actually, we can expect the U.S. regional commitment and engagement further. Now, a shift when the Democratic administration comes into power, you might think that we think they will focus on climate change measures, and with China, they will try to cooperate with China on a global basis, such as climate change measures. And the regional engagement based on multilateralism in economy and also security, that might be increased. That is what I expect from the Democratic administration, and maybe human rights might be advocated further. So overall tone between the two countries is competition, but there's a calibration and adjustment. That is my assumption. Yes, from myself, I have, this is the last question, and I would like to open the floor. 2020, in the presidential election, from a medium and longer term perspective, for the world, for the U.S., and for Japan, and for your think tank, what sort of significance would it have from a medium and longer term perspective? Historical significance of the presidential election, Mr. Lohman?
Historical significance of the 2020 election.
Yeah. Well, like I say, I think that in some ways on trade policy, for instance, we will continue a trend that's ongoing now, regardless of which candidate wins. On China, I think you have a lot of steam built up behind this negative approach to China, and I think a Congress will keep any president's feet to the fire on this. Whether President Buttigieg wants to open up to China, there's going to be a tremendous amount of resistance to that on the Hill. The one thing I'll point out that could be a big deal, and we haven't focused on it much, is this issue of defense spending. After increases in the last 3 or 4 years in defense budgets and shipbuilding and new plans for the Navy to build more ships, we still aren't even close to where we need to be. We're still not on track to build 355 ships, or however many we need. That's what the Navy's plan is. And we're not there yet on readiness. And so if the next president, and it could be Trump too, Trump has made some sounds like, okay, I've spent money on defense the last 4 years, you got what you wanted. Next administration, I'm cutting it. He has said things like that. And so, it's not assured that we continue to increase defense budgets in the next administration, but I think it's almost a certainty that the next Democrat president will cut defense budgets. And if he has support on the Hill, which still have a Democrat House, I think those cuts will be sustained. And so our ability to stay present in the region and to stay present in a way that can be relevant to the China challenge, I think will be in question. And as time goes on, that will become more and more obvious. The weight of it will make a big difference.
ありがとう。じゃあ、森さんお願い。
Professor Mori, please. Well, as Dr. Lohman had mentioned, this defense spending would affect the U.S. allies as well. And maybe this is too abstract, but when it comes to U.S. leadership, and as mentioned by Dr. Green, rule-based international order to be supported and bolstered by the United States. That kind of image would be impacted by maybe the re-election of Trump or either the election of a new Democratic president. So if there is a Democratic president to the allies, I believe that we have to really be ready to really go for this self-help arrangement. Now, if a group of nations is formed and if the international order is to be maintained in that format, maybe the president in the future would not be Trump, but there may be a president who would emphasize different aspects of the U.S. foreign policy. And depending on what is going to be emphasized in the foreign policy, the impact on Japan would differ.
Would be a scenario where President Trump gets reelected. He survives impeachment and he gets reelected, and he decides he's invincible. And he becomes arrogant enough that he begins really violating the American Constitution and degrading institutions. He's already badly damaged the State Department. He's badly damaged the intelligence community's morale. He's badly damaged the Justice Department. And more recently, he's badly damaged military morale with his decision to intervene in military court decisions about special operations forces who violated the law of war. And so you have degraded institutions, and the president can't attract talent because a lot of people like myself on the Republican side, were very critical of President Trump, so we're not going to be going in. But those who weren't critical and did go in, many of them had a very bad experience. It's very, very hard to work for President Trump. And so he degrades institutions. He can't get talented people. He gets more people who are kind of yes men. He gets fewer people who say, no, you can't do that, sir. And then he gets impeached again because he goes so far that a reluctant Democratic Congress feels they have to impeach him again. And that's a recipe for real political instability and distraction and weak leadership by the U.S. I personally don't think it means the U.S. is an isolationist country. I really don't believe that. I think it's an accident of politics twice, but it doesn't mean the American people are turning away from the world. But it would be very bad for the international situation. But I'm not sure that'll happen. For example, it's possible if President Trump gets reelected, it's possible you have people who do rise up and start to learn how to work in a Trump administration. Steve Biegun, who will be the new Deputy Secretary of State, who Walter and I know well, is a very good man, a very traditional internationalist Republican, and he knows how to work in this strange environment to get things done. So it's possible you'll have people, Nikki Haley, people who know how to be leading in Washington and leading with allies in the world, and how to manage President Trump, and that's possible. And then, of course, you could have a Democratic win. I would worry about, I'm showing my political colors, but I would worry about a Warren or Sanders administration for the reasons Walter said: drastic cuts in defense spending and even more isolationist trade policies. Warren's a little more flexible. She's a little more like Hillary Clinton. So my wife reminds me, remember, she can't do everything she's saying. And I say, is that a good thing or a bad thing? And she say, well, it may turn out to be a good thing if she gets elected. It could be we have, a centrist Democrat win, who really starts to forge consensus around some foreign policies. Or, remember, if Trump gets reelected, he will really be a lame duck at that point. And you could start having new voices in the Republican Party emerge, not in the first 2 years, but in the second 2 years of an administration, who have a more internationalist approach. So it's really a variety of possible outcomes. I personally don't believe the American people are isolationist. I really don't. And the problem is we are easily, as a people, distracted. And the political scenarios I've described, some of them would be very distracting.
ありがとうございます。それではここでご質問をいただければと思います。
So now we would like to open the floor for questions. I would appreciate if you can be brief in your question. Please introduce yourself, your name and affiliation. Thank you. My name is Ishihara from the Maritime Self-Defense Forces and the School of Navy. So I would like to ask you a question about Trump's relation to the U.S. forces. So there were many military incumbents who supported, of course, the U.S. forces, but they were discharged. Many of them were discharged and dismissed. And recently, how the Navy SEALs are treated. That was even intervened by Trump, I think, and the Secretary of Navy resigned, according to my understanding. So this makes me feel that the relationship between Trump and the U.S. forces is deteriorating. Is it correct? And I'd like...
Okay. Hi, Mike. Hi, Walter. The business executives in Japan are more and more concerned at when the United States is withdrawing from international commitment. So my question is whether, perhaps you talked about China and Asia, but how about, say, Middle East or Africa, if the U.S. may have less commitment in coming years in the next administration or next Trump administration? I think U.S. will continue to engage in Asia or China, but maybe less and less in Middle East because of the oil production or gas production in the United States. How about that aspect?
My name is Hiroshi Tajima, a member of JIIA. My question is about NATO enlargement, its influence on U.S.-Russia relations. NATO enlargement is a great program to Russia. It has deteriorated relations between the U.S. and Russia. But I think it is also a big problem to the United States. I'll cite two reasons. First, prospects of Russia-China alignment. The U.S. regards Russia and China as great rivals. But NATO enlargement may drive Russia to approach China for alignment against the U.S. Coincidentally, today's newspaper reports the cooperation between Russia and China on natural gas pipeline projects. Putin said,
よろしいでしょうか。大体そんな感じで。
Excuse me. Okay. So, what is your question?
Credibility would be tested if Russia invaded.
はい、わかりました。はい、すみません、時間。
Okay, I'm sorry. The time is limited, so I would like to refer to that as well. So I think we have received a total of 3 questions. And I hope the panelists would briefly answer these questions. And if there are anything else that you forgot to mention or anything that I didn't question, please add those points as well. So as a closing statement, please answer the questions and add some points that you would like to share with the audience. Mr. Mori, please. Thank you very much. I'd like to be brief. First of all, this relationship between Trump and the U.S. forces, even if there are some incidents, the discipline of the U.S. forces are really very firm. And so I think the relationship had not swayed so much, and it's not faltering. And the relationship between the president and the Secretary of Defense sometimes, from time to time, had deteriorated. But I think in this in the series of administrations of the recent history of the United States, I don't think you need to worry about this. And the question not addressed to me, but about this policy in the Middle East and also Africa. Well, I don't necessarily think that U.S. intervened in this region because they wanted energy to be imported into the United States. Well, rather, want to reduce the cost in being involved in conflicts abroad. I think that is a greater rationale for the president to change the policy in the Middle Eastern region or in Africa. I think that would be the greatest reason.
先生からもいろいろな事件が起こると、大きなイベントがあると、やはり世論も変わりますし、アメリカ全体の空気が変わりますので、一概にじゃあ大統領が
Public opinion will change if there are major events. So just because the president is saying that they would like to reduce presence in certain countries, it won't happen that easily. U.S. stance might change because of major events in the world. Now, credibility of NATO. According to American newspapers and media, I think in 2017, Mr. Trump several times mentioned withdrawal from NATO or withdrawal of American forces from overseas, and there was increased concern about this. Credibility is a subjective perception. So I think NATO's credibility was hurt because of those statements by Mr. Trump. And that is why France and Germany are now trying to make self-help efforts in defense. There's a good part as well as bad parts to it, but that's my opinion.
So I have military in my family. My wife has military on her side of the family. Every military officer I know voted for Trump. And I'm not surprised because in the Obama administration, the budget, so-called sequestration cap, meant that sailors and Marines who might deploy for 6 months were being forced to deploy for 9 months. And aircraft were having more accidents because they had less training time because of the budget. So in general, the military was very eager for a Republican president to increase defense spending. It will be interesting to see how this most recent episode affects that. President Trump intervened in a case where three different special operations, three special operators were accused of war crimes, and he's campaigning on it and he's bragging about it, and he's making it look like he overturned the 3-star or 4-star admirals and generals. But the men in those units, the corporals, the Navy SEALs, not the officers, the men in those units are going on TV and saying, no, they should have gone to jail. What they did was wrong. So it'll be interesting to see if this backfires. Our friends who are Navy officers, very good friends of ours, and our kids are friends, we would barbecue in the backyard, and my 9-year-old daughter would say, Trump's no good, Trump's terrible, and his 9-year-old son would say, Trump's going to make America great again. My mommy and daddy say. I noticed recently we were having a barbecue in the backyard, and the little boy from the military family said, yeah, my mommy and daddy used to think Trump would make America great again. Now they're just worried about the future of the country. So that's one small piece of anecdotal evidence, but at least from the military, and I know in my family, they are really offended. And so we'll see if it affects his relationship with the military. Frankly, I think it should, because he's damaging. He's treating the military as political pawns. It's not just the case of the Navy SEAL and the special operators. It's also the debate with Japan and Korea and NATO over host nation support. He's acting like the military are mercenaries. And I think it's really bad, and I know senior officers are really appalled. We'll see if it has a political effect. It may not. If the other candidate is Elizabeth Warren and she's going to cut defense spending, those people will vote for Trump out of their self-interest. On the Middle East, you know, in public opinion polls, Americans are much more committed to alliances, much more willing to fight wars in Asia. But in the Middle East, it's the support for military intervention has gone way, way down. And I also think we have to admit that the reasons that the American people have supported a strong presence in the Middle East in the past have included oil, but also Israel. And I worry that the Israel policy issue in Washington has become too partisan. And President Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu have really, for short-term political gain, done long-term political damage to the bipartisan support needed for the U.S. to support Israel, which I personally support quite strongly. And that could also affect this. Strategically, people understand that even if we're self-sufficient in energy, our key allies like Japan or Korea are not. And the global economy and global stability still depends on stability in the Middle East. I think strategically people generally understand that pretty well. But the views about intervention in the Middle East and the politicization of Israel policy, not next year or the year after, but down the road, could have a negative impact. Lee Kuan Yew used to warn Americans, you can't just pivot out of the Middle East and ignore the Middle East and expect everyone in Asia to be happy. These are all interconnected. So it would be quite a problem. And on Russia and China, there's clearly more collaboration strategically between Russia and China. The combined bomber operations over Japan and Korea's ADIZ, air defense identification zones. Obvious intelligence collaboration with Snowden and other cases, arms sales, and then the LNG. I don't think we can stop that. But it is, in my view, useful that Prime Minister Abe has a good relationship with Putin. He's the only member of the G7 who does. And although I think there's no chance for Northern Territories resolution between Japan and Russia, nevertheless, it's useful for the U.S. or Europe that Prime Minister Abe has some ability to talk candidly to Putin, because we don't want to completely drive Russia into China's camp or China into Russia's camp. But that said, I think we should not soften our approach on either China or Russia in the hopes that somehow we can stop them from cooperating, because they'll just see it as weakness, in my view.
I'll just comment on the question about the international commitments. You know, since Trump's election, there's been a game afoot, really, to, in some quarters, to associate all of his positions with some of the craziness that surrounds him. A lot of those positions are traditional Republican or traditional conservative positions, but the idea is to take those things that you've opposed for a long time, could be tax cuts, and you lump it into all the crazy things that Trump does. Oh, there he goes, he's cutting taxes, it's so crazy, he's killing the middle class, et cetera, et cetera. It's just traditional. Jeb Bush would have done the same thing. That tax package could have easily been a Jeb Bush tax package. That's just to say that every time there's a policy dispute or a policy difference doesn't mean it's the end of the world. You can oppose the JCPOA and not be an isolationist. You know, during the debates over the JCPOA, there are plenty of people who said, you know, if you want to do this, you should get it ratified in the Senate. And Obama said, well, it'll never happen if I have to get it ratified. oh, well, that's the Constitution. You know, you get it ratified, and then we don't have somebody pulling out like this. Or our presence in all of these various conflicts around the world. We didn't send troops to all these places to stay forever, you know, and so at some point, even Afghanistan, the goal is to get those guys home eventually, hopefully with a stable Afghanistan and a place that's not a safe haven for terrorists, but we want to bring them home someday. The Middle East, the same thing. You know, just because you want them to come home and you want to draw down in wars around the world, it doesn't make you an isolationist. It's not the end of the world and doesn't mark sort of a sea change in U.S. policy. And I'd say the same with regard to getting some sort of congressional authorization for the use of force. I mean, the President of the United States isn't a king. He shouldn't be able to just send forces all around the world at the drop of a hat and they stay there for 20 years. You know, we ought to be able to have a real debate over the deployment of forces. So anyway, just to try to put some of the disagreements in perspective. Thanks.
どうもありがとうございました。残りの時間が1分半、2分ぐらいということで、もうそろそろ終わりにしなければ。
Well, we only have about a minute or so left for this session, so this is going to be the final question. So on the date of the presidential election, who is going to be the president? Well, this is off the record. We're not taking a video recording, but if you can make a wild guess, I know that you have to speculate, but tell us who's going to be the president.
So the betting markets give him 15%, but I say Buttigieg.
I say if the election were held today, Donald Trump.
That's cheating.
Between today and November means something major has to change. So if it were November today, I mean, if nothing changes, I just don't see any of the candidates being, a viable competitor to him right now. He's got 43%, 42% of the vote that is absolutely rock solid. He really could shoot someone on Fifth Avenue and those people would support him. And, when you start with that, it's a pretty good starting place.
In 2016, I have pledged myself I would never make a guess. But the Democrats are divided. So under the current circumstances, Trump. So who do you think would be the new U.S. president? With that, we have run out of time, and we have to bring this session to a close. So thank you very much for your attendance. And in relation to the foreign policy, we have talked about the outcome of the U.S. presidential election. Please give a big hand to the panelists. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We will break for 10 minutes. In this room, there will be a breakout session for challenges to multilateral systems. 5, developments surrounding the Korean Peninsula and steps toward forming a new order, is in the next room. And number 6, territorial maritime issues and challenges to the rule of law, will be held in Kirinoma.